The sizzle of my perfectly seared burger patty was, to me, the purest sound on earth. Well, almost. The other pure sound? The opening guitar riff of Tom Sawyer by Rush, currently emanating from my brand new outdoor speakers at what I considered a spirited volume. My apron, emblazoned with license to grill, felt less like a novelty item and more like a sacred relic. It was a Saturday afternoon. The sun was high. The smell of charcoal and perfectly rendered beef fat mingled gloriously in the air, and Neil Peart's drums were assaulting the heavens. Life, I thought, could not get any better. I was Leo Martinez, 38, graphic designer, and sovereign lord of my own meticulously manicured backyard in the heart of Sunset Meadows. And in my kingdom, Rush played on. I flipped the burger, admiring the perfect crosshatch marks. Dave, my best friend, was probably at home, glued to his computer, optimizing some server farm or another. He wouldn't understand the primal joy of open-air grilling and open-air rock. He'd probably suggest headphones. Headphones, I scoffed internally. That's like eating a gourmet meal with a clothespin on your nose. You miss the aroma, the experience. No, my outdoor speakers were an investment in lifestyle, a declaration that joy, when properly amplified, was non-negotiable. Suddenly, a shadow fell across my perfectly green lawn. It wasn't a cloud. It was Brenda from next door. Brenda Albright. My neighbor. My nemesis. The woman who communicated primarily through laminated notes and withering glances. She appeared at the fence line, framed by her immaculately trimmed privet hedge, which, unlike my speakers, was always precisely within HOA guidelines. Her posture was so rigidly proper, it looked like she'd swallowed a yardstick. Her hands were clasped in front of her, a stance I'd come to recognize as imminent complaint deployment. "Leo," she began, her voice a precise, modulated tone that could cut glass without raising a decibel. "That's a very energetic song." I beamed, oblivious. "It's a classic, Brenda, the foundation of modern rock. Neil Peart on the drums, Geddy Lee's vocals, pure poetry. It's invigorating, isn't it?" Her lips thinned imperceptibly. "It's just that my begonias are vibrating. And I think a hummingbird just had a panic attack near my bird feeder. The HOA Guidelines, Section 4, Paragraph B, Leo, explicitly mention ambient noise levels and the peaceful enjoyment of all residents' properties." I frowned, affecting an air of deep contemplation. Ambient noise. Well, if you think about it, Brenda, Rush is ambient. It permeates the atmosphere. It fills the void. It's part of the fabric of existence. I gave her my most charming, utterly insincere smile. "Is this ambient enough for you?" I reached over to the remote and, with a flourish, turned the volume down a barely perceptible notch. The change was so minimal I doubted even a bat could detect it. Brenda, however, blinked. It was the equivalent of a primal scream in her world. "Leo," she reiterated, her voice now a shade colder than a winter frost. "I believe the term ambient implies a background presence, not a sonic assault." "Sonic experience," I corrected, ever the stickler for semantics. "Are your begonias feeling better now, Brenda? Perhaps a gentle sway?" She simply stared, her eyes narrowing. It was a stare that promised future administrative action. "I believe I've made my position clear, Leo." "Crystal, Brenda, absolutely crystal." I gave a dismissive wave, turning back to my grill. The conversation ended in a stalemate, as most of our conversations did. I finished my burgers, ate them in blissful, Rush-accompanied solitude, and thought no more of it. Until the next morning. I stepped out to retrieve my newspaper, still in my dinosaur print pajamas, and found it. Taped to my front door, right at eye level, was a piece of paper. It wasn't just any paper. It was a laminated note. 3 different highlighter colors had been used: pink for noise ordinance violation, yellow for repeat offender, and green for immediate rectification required. Brenda had gone full HOA. She hadn't just cited the rule, she had framed it for posterity. "Laminated!" I roared later that evening, pacing my living room like a caged tiger. Dave, bless his patient soul, was on the other end of the phone, listening to my rant. The laminated note, now crumpled from my fury, was in my hand. "She laminated it, Dave. Laminated. Who does that? This isn't a Denny's menu, it's a declaration of war. A formal, waterproof declaration of war." "Dude," Dave said, his voice the calm, reasonable counterpoint to my hysteria. "Just use headphones. It's not worth it. You'll just get more notes. Maybe she'll start sending you cease and desist letters written in glitter glue." "No, it's the principle, Dave. The fresh air, the open sound, the majesty of classic rock flowing freely. It's about freedom. They can't regulate the air itself. They don't own the airwaves." I stopped pacing. My eyes, which had been darting wildly around the room, suddenly went wide. My brain, usually occupied with font choices and hex codes, had just made a connection. Airwaves. "Wait a second," I muttered, my voice trailing off. I walked over to my computer, the crumpled laminated note still clutched in my hand. Airwaves. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Low-power FM transmitter kit, legally compliant. A website loaded. My eyes scanned the page. Part 15 FCC compliant, broadcasts within a limited range, no license required. A slow, evil grin spread across my face. This wasn't just a speaker system anymore. This was something entirely different. Something magnificent. Something that would bypass Brenda's HOA regulations entirely. They couldn't regulate the sound coming from my property, maybe, but they certainly couldn't regulate the airwaves that weren't being used for commercial purposes. Could they? The fine print confirmed it. As long as it was low power and didn't interfere with licensed broadcasts, it was a legal gray area the size of Texas. I found a listing. Hobbyist FM transmitter kit easy assembly. My finger hovered over the Buy It Now button. Dave's voice crackled through the phone, sounding increasingly alarmed. "Leo, what did you just do? I hear a Buy It Now click. That's never a good sound. That's the sound of terrible decisions being made." I pressed the button. "I'm not fighting her on her turf, Dave," I declared, my grin widening into a triumphant leer. "I'm taking this battle to a whole new frequency." The transmitter kit arrived 2 days later in a surprisingly small box. Hobbyist FM transmitter kit, easy assembly, the box proclaimed in cheerful, optimistic font. What lay within, however, told a different story. It was a confusing mess of circuit boards, resistors, capacitors, tiny coils of copper wire, and an instruction manual whose English translation seemed to have been run through Google Translate about 3 times too many. "Solder red filament to primary capacitor node," read one particular gem, accompanied by a diagram that looked less like an electrical component and more like a poorly drawn alien insect. Dave, my best friend, was present for the unboxing. He had arrived, ostensibly, to talk me out of this escalating act of suburban rebellion. Instead, he was now hunched over the coffee table, peering through his reading glasses at the circuit board with the intensity of a bomb disposal expert. "Dude," he stated, without looking up, "the instructions say, solder red filament to primary capacitor node. Leo, you once superglued your hand to a coffee mug trying to fix a broken handle. This feels several steps beyond your current skill set." "Details, Dave, details." I waved a dismissive hand, already unwrapping a tiny spool of solder. "It's intuitive. Besides, how hard can it be? It's for hobbyists. I am a hobbyist. My hobby is now broadcast engineering. It's like building Lego, but with more fire risk." Dave sighed, a long, suffering sound. "Lego pieces don't usually emit smoke if you put them in the wrong slot." We embarked on what quickly became known as Operation Airwave Dominance. It was less of an operation and more of a protracted, frustrating comedy of errors. My soldering skills were, to put it mildly, rudimentary. I managed to melt plastic, fuse wires where they shouldn't be fused, and create several tiny accidental stalagmites of solder on the circuit board. Dave, with his IT background, understood the theory of electricity, but had only ever touched a soldering iron in a desperate attempt to fix a vintage console. "I think this red filament is actually a lead," Dave mumbled, tracing a line on the diagram with his finger. "And the primary capacitor node looks an awful lot like the secondary resistor port." Potato, I said confidently, then immediately let out a yelp as I accidentally touched the tip of the soldering iron to my thumb. "Ow, see, it's hot. That means it's working." A small puff of smoke, thick and acrid, billowed from the circuit board at one point. We both jumped back, staring at it as if it might explode. "Did you just summon a tiny electrical demon?" Dave asked, wide-eyed. "No, I think I just repurposed a resistor," I muttered, coughing. For an hour, the transmitter, once assembled, broadcast nothing but the barely audible hum from my garage refrigerator. Then, for a glorious 5 minutes, it picked up the high-pitched squawks of a baby monitor from 3 houses down. We listened, transfixed, as a tiny voice demanded, "More juice box!" before Dave quickly yanked the power cord. "Okay," Dave said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "This is probably a felony." But we persevered, driven by a combination of stubbornness, spite, and the sheer challenge of it all. We finally got it working. The indicator light glowed a steady green. The small antenna, a flimsy wire affair, seemed to shimmer with potential. I hooked up my phone to the audio input. "Okay," I said, a tremble of excitement in my voice. "Moment of truth. What's the first track of K. Leo?" Dave, still looking skeptical, crossed his arms. "I'm sure it'll be something understated. A gentle classical piece, perhaps." I grinned, a wide, triumphant, utterly unhinged grin. I queued up the track. The opening chords, defiant and rebellious, filled the shed. "We're Not Gonna Take It" by Twisted Sister. I grabbed a cheap microphone I'd bought online, my voice crackling with anticipation. "Good evening, Sunset Meadows," I boomed into the mic, my voice distorted just enough to sound authentically pirate radio-esque. "You're listening to 88.1 K. Leo, the sound of freedom and properly seasoned meats. This first song is dedicated to a very special listener next door. Brenda, this one's for you." I cranked the volume knob on the transmitter, sending the glorious, defiant anthem surging through the airwaves. Dave just stared at me. "You are a child, an absolute infant." "A genius infant," I corrected, pumping my fist in the air to the beat. "And listen, the range. I can hear it in your car, right?" He pulled out his phone, opened a radio app, and tuned to 88.1. Twisted Sister, tinny but unmistakable, blared from his phone speaker. "It's working. Oh God, it's actually working. The gods of suburbia weep." We stepped outside, Dave shaking his head, me practically dancing. We couldn't hear it much from my yard. The signal was weak, just as legally mandated. But the magic was in the broadcast, in the potential. We knew it was out there. Then we saw it. Brenda's curtains, next door, twitched. A moment later, her back door opened. She emerged, holding an old portable radio, its antenna extended. She walked around her meticulously kept yard, holding the radio like a divining rod, her face a mask of confusion, then dawning horror. She stopped near the fence, pointed the antenna directly at my garage. And her face contorted. It was a masterpiece of suburban fury. I couldn't help myself. I gave her a jaunty wave. She glared, then stomped back inside, slamming her door with a force that made my entire house vibrate. She heard it, I whispered, a reverent awe in my voice. She heard me. Mission accomplished. Dave simply placed a hand on my shoulder. This is either going to be legendary, or you're going to end up in federal prison for disturbing the peace with hair metal. The initial thrill of the first broadcast was intoxicating, but fleeting. Broadcasting from my garage was, frankly, undignified. A true radio station, even a micro one, deserved a proper home. A dedicated space. A monument to freedom and classic rock. I need a studio, I declared to Dave on a Tuesday evening, after discovering that the garage door opener was occasionally interfering with my signal, causing the guitar solos to sound like they were playing underwater. Dave, who was attempting to explain the nuances of network architecture to me, simply blinked. A studio? Leo, you're broadcasting Rush from a $50 kit. You don't need a studio, you need a better hobby. No, Dave. I need to professionalize, to optimize, to create a sonic sanctuary where the muses of rock can truly sing. I was already scrolling through online catalogs, ignoring his pleas. My gaze landed on a high-end garden shed, the tall barn model. It looked sturdy, imposing, perfect. Yes, this one. It's got enough headroom for my future vinyl collection. I was soon on the phone with a local contractor company, attempting to explain my very specific, very unusual requirements. Yes, I need your best shed, I told the man on the phone, trying to sound as casual as if I were ordering a pizza. The tall barn model, but I have some custom requirements. I need it soundproofed, and I'll need extra conduits run for wiring, multiple power outlets, maybe some recessed lighting. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then a gravelly voice responded. Soundproof. What are you doing in there? Running a secret interrogation site? Or maybe a very, very loud karaoke bar for squirrels? It's for my podcast, I stammered, caught off guard. I'd decided podcast was a more palatable term than rebellious, low-power FM radio station dedicated to annoying my neighbor. Right, a podcast, the voice drawled, clearly unconvinced. All right, kid, we'll send Sal and Vince out to take a look. They've seen weirder, probably. Sal and Vince arrived 2 days later. They were a duo straight out of a mob movie casting call. Sal was a burly man with forearms like tree trunks and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow. Vince was leaner, with sharp, assessing eyes and a perpetual smirk. They both wore faded work pants and t-shirts that had clearly seen decades of construction dust. They looked like they could build a skyscraper with their bare hands or crack walnuts with their teeth. They surveyed my backyard, their eyes taking in the pristine lawn, the offending fence line, and my eager, slightly frantic expression. So this is the spot for the podcast shed? Sal asked, his voice a low rumble. Broadcast studio, I corrected, puffing out my chest slightly. Vince nudged Sal with his elbow. Right, broadcast studio. You want the window facing the house or facing her house? He jerked a thumb unceremoniously toward Brenda's dwelling. I didn't even have to think about it. Her house, definitely her house. Sal and Vince exchanged a look that spoke volumes. It said, "This guy's completely nuts, but he's paying us, so who cares?" They were utterly unfazed, which was both reassuring and slightly concerning. They proceeded to offer absurdly practical advice that inadvertently aided my ridiculous quest. "You'll want to ground that antenna mast, kid," Sal advised, squinting at the sky. "Lightning hits that. You'll broadcast your fillings to the whole tri-state area." And for soundproofing, Vince added, tapping the proposed spot with his boot. You're gonna need dense mass. We got some industrial-grade panels, usually used for shooting ranges. They'll keep whatever racket you're making inside. Perfect, I exclaimed, picturing myself safe and sound inside my custom-built sonic fortress. The studio shed went up with surprising speed. Sal and Vince worked with an efficiency that belied their laconic demeanor. Within a week, the tall barn model stood proudly in my backyard, painted a tasteful, HOA-compliant beige. I had to pick my battles. Inside, it was a cavern of sound-dampening panels, extra thick drywall, and enough electrical outlets to power a small concert. I moved in my equipment. A proper mixing board, overkill but it looked cool, a decent condenser microphone, and a small stack of my favorite classic rock vinyl. My initial $50 transmitter kit was still the heart of the operation, but now it felt like a sophisticated beast, not a glorified toy. I started doing proper shows. Manic Mondays featured high-energy anthems. Classic Rock Block was a deep dive into album tracks. And then there was my crown jewel, HOA Horror Stories, a talk segment where I read anonymous submissions from other disgruntled neighbors. Full disclosure, most of the initial anonymous submissions were just me writing under pseudonyms like Furious Flora and Grumpy Gus, detailing grievances about mandatory flowerbed designs and the tragic saga of a rogue gnome statue. One afternoon, as I was practicing my DJ voice, attempting to sound like a grizzled radio veteran instead of a man in his late 30s talking to himself in a shed, I saw a moving truck across the street. A new neighbor? Great. Another potential target for Brenda's HOA evangelism. A woman was wrestling with a large, awkward keyboard stand, trying to get it out of the truck. She had dark, curly hair pulled back in a messy bun, and she looked thoroughly exasperated. I heard a faint echo of Stairway to Heaven coming from her car radio, which was still running. She fiddled with the dial, looking puzzled. Then she tuned it. Her eyes widened slightly, and she walked over to my fence. "Excuse me," she called out, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Are you 88.1 KLEO?" I nearly dropped my microphone. I hadn't expected to be recognized. Broadcasting live from the heart of suburbia. Why?" She grinned, a genuinely warm, engaging smile. "Your audio compression is a little muddy, and you're broadcasting in mono. You really should be in stereo for the full effect of that Led Zeppelin drum solo. It's a waste of Bonham's genius." My jaw dropped. This woman, my new neighbor, wasn't complaining. She was offering technical advice. She understood. You get it," I managed, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through me. This was Chloe, my new neighbor, and she was already an ally. Life as the self-appointed voice of suburban rebellion had settled into a rhythm. My studio shed, now affectionately dubbed the Fortress of Solitude and Sound, was my sanctuary. Chloe, my new neighbor, had proven to be an invaluable resource. She wasn't just amused by KLEO, she genuinely appreciated the technical challenge of optimizing a low-power backyard radio station. She even suggested a better antenna design, one that Sal and Vince, in a moment of pure contractor glee, promised to build for me out of industrial-grade lightning-proof aluminum. My shows were getting bolder. I'd moved from merely reading HOA horror stories to actively dissecting the bylaws, offering sarcastic commentary on everything from permissible mailbox fonts to the infuriatingly vague aesthetic harmony clause. I was in the middle of a particularly scathing monologue about the tyranny of mandatory lawn aeration, a recent Brenda-initiated decree, when the doorbell rang. "And who's to say a lawn wants to be aerated, folks?" I pontificated into the mic, my voice full of righteous indignation. Perhaps it enjoys a dense, root-bound existence. Has anyone asked the lawn? Ding dong! I paused mid-rant. My internal monologue screeched to a halt. The doorbell. It wasn't Dave's impatient knock, nor Chloe's cheerful, inquisitive tap. Through the shed window, I could see the reflection of red and blue lights flashing rhythmically against the front of my house. "Oh, for crying out loud," I muttered, killing the broadcast with a flick of the master power switch. The sudden silence in the shed was deafening. This was it. The man had arrived. Or, more accurately, the men and women of the law. I walked to my front door, stomach churning with a mix of dread and perverse excitement. I peered through the peephole. 2 officers stood on my porch. Officer Miller, a woman with a no-nonsense bun and an expression that suggested she'd seen it all and was tired of it. And Officer Davis, a younger, greener cop who was visibly trying and failing to suppress a grin. I took a deep breath, pasted on my most innocent expression, and opened the door. "Sir," Officer Miller began, her voice as flat as the Kansas prairie. "We've had a novel complaint. A noise complaint regarding an unlicensed radio broadcast." Officer Davis, standing slightly behind her, was craning his neck, trying to catch a glimpse of my studio shed in the backyard. His shoulders were shaking. I could practically hear his internal monologue. "Please don't laugh. Please don't laugh. This is serious police business." "Officer," I said, adopting my most earnest, reasonable tone. "It's a low-power, federally compliant hobby transmitter. Part 15 of the FCC code. Totally legal. It's for my podcast." Officer Miller raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Your podcast dedicated to a Miss Brenda Albright and her tyrannical reign over begonias?" I cleared my throat. "It has a broad focus. We also discuss classic rock, the best cuts of meat for grilling, and occasionally the socioeconomic impact of inefficient sprinkler systems." Officer Davis let out a choked sound, which he tried to disguise as a cough. Officer Miller shot him a withering glance. "Look, Mr. Martinez," Miller continued, her patience wearing thin, "we've read the complaint. Miss Albright alleges that your podcast is thinly veiled harassment, while your equipment may technically fall under Part 15 regulations, using it specifically to, quote, mock her meticulously selected landscape features and personal character, falls into a gray area. A very, very gray area that is rapidly approaching the color black." I crossed my arms. "But I'm just exercising my freedom of speech. The airwaves are public domain." "The airwaves are regulated, sir," Miller corrected. "And while we don't have a broadcasting classic rock with malicious intent code on the books, Miss Albright has called 9 times today. 9. Each time sounding more distressed. You gotta dial it back. Or, at the very least, broaden your broad focus to less personal topics." Officer Davis, having seemingly composed himself, piped up, "On an unrelated note, Officer Miller, could we play some ZZ Top later? The wife loves 'em." Miller stared at him for a long moment. "He's joking," she said to me, her voice clipped. "Sir, this is an official warning. Keep the peace. Or at least keep your broadcast to topics that don't involve your neighbor's gardening choices." They turned to leave. As they walked down my driveway, Officer Davis couldn't resist. He glanced back at me, gave a quick, almost imperceptible thumbs up, and then quickly resumed his stoic police walk when Miller looked his way. I stood on my porch for a moment, absorbing the interaction. They didn't shut me down, they didn't confiscate my equipment, they just told me to be quiet, to dial it back. That, to me, sounded less like a threat and more like a challenge, a dare. A slow smile spread across my face. They hadn't understood. This wasn't just about sound anymore. This was about principle, and now about public opinion. I walked back to the shed, a new song already forming in my mind. I flipped the master switch back on, waited for the faint hum of power to return, and then, with newfound determination, queued up I Fought the Law by The Clash. This time, however, I turned the volume down a very slightly perceptible notch, just enough to claim I'd complied, just enough to be a good, technically within the letter of the law citizen. The peace, I decided, could be kept, just not the silence. The police visit, far from being a deterrent, had inadvertently supercharged Kay Leo's notoriety. It was the kind of dramatic escalation that catapults a local eccentric into a minor folk hero. My phone buzzed incessantly the next morning. It was Dave, his voice a panicked squawk. "Leo, you're not going to believe this! You're trending! Well, in Sunset Meadows, anyway." "Trending?" I asked, wiping sleep from my eyes. Am I finally getting recognized for my insightful commentary on mandatory sprinkler system calibration? No. Someone in the neighborhood started a Facebook group called I Listen to Kay Leo 88.1. It has 78 members. And a local alt-weekly blog just posted a piece, Suburban Radio War, Lone Homeowner Battles HOA with Classic Rock and Passive Aggression. My eyes widened. I quickly navigated to the blog post. There it was, complete with a grainy, zoomed-in photo of my shed. The article, a humorous, slightly exaggerated account of the radio station and the HOA's valiant and laminated efforts to silence it, painted me as a beleaguered champion of the common man. There was even a picture of my face photoshopped onto Che Guevara's body, emblazoned with the caption, El Presidente of Rock and Roll. El Presidente of Rock and Roll, I exclaimed, admiration for my anonymous fan surging through me. I like it. Dave, this isn't a nuisance, this is a movement. Dave groaned. It's a movement towards a federal indictment, Leo. You're a meme. A very high-risk meme. But I couldn't be deterred. The public, it seemed, was on my side. Or at least they found my plight amusing enough to follow. I decided to lean into my new identity. I opened up the station to call-ins, albeit on a burner phone I'd bought specifically for this purpose. And the calls started coming. Not from me this time. From actual, living, breathing neighbors. Kay Leo, you're on the air, I'd announce, adopting my most gravitas-filled DJ voice. Yeah, Leo, it's Martha from Elm Street, a shaky voice would say. And they measured my grass with a ruler. A ruler! It was half an inch too long. Who owns a grass ruler? Another call. This is Gary from Maplewood. You know that unapproved beige mailbox complaint? That was me. It's beige. What other kind of beige is there? It's just beige. The calls were glorious. They were therapeutic for the callers, hilarious for me, and, I suspected, increasingly infuriating for Brenda. Chloe, meanwhile, had become my unofficial station engineer. She'd often pop over after work, a thermos of tea in hand, offering advice on microphone placement, signal strength, and even suggesting new segments. You know, she'd say, tweaking a dial on the mixing board, you should really do a Battle of the Bands segment, but with local lawn care companies. Have people call in their horror stories. Chloe, I'd reply, looking at her with genuine awe, you're a genius. Our rapport had become easy, flirty, and fun. She seemed to genuinely enjoy the absurdity of it all, and her presence made the shed feel less like a solitary crusade and more like a collaboration. The HOA, however, was not amused. My accidental fame only fueled Brenda's righteous indignation. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived. Not from Brenda directly, but from the HOA's lawyer. It was a formal cease and desist, threatening escalating fines, legal action, and unspecified remedial measures if Kay Leo didn't immediately cease broadcasting. It was filled with legalese, referencing tortious interference, nuisance abatement, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I read it live on the air, my voice dripping with mock solemnity. Folks, it says here I'm causing irreparable harm to the tranquil aesthetic of the community. The only thing being harmed here is Brenda's sense of absolute power. I burst out laughing. They even hyphenated aesthetic correctly, which I have to give them credit for. But honestly, tranquil aesthetic? My aesthetic involves good classic rock and the smell of grilling meats, which is far more tranquil than a laminated note threatening legal action. The KLEO 88.1 Facebook group exploded with supportive comments. Fight the power, Leo. My mailbox is beige too. Play some Lynyrd Skynyrd for the lawyers. It was exhilarating. I was no longer just a guy playing loud music. I was a symbol, a beacon of rebellion in a sea of perfectly manicured lawns. I was riding high on the waves of my own making, oblivious to the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The federal horizon. The high of local fame. The camaraderie with Chloe. The delicious schadenfreude of annoying Brenda. It all evaporated the moment I saw the brown envelope. It wasn't a pastel HOA letter, nor a lawyer's sterile white. This was thick, official, and bore the unmistakable return address of a federal government agency. The Federal Communications Commission. My heart seized. This was no longer about passive-aggressive gardening disputes or the battle over beige mailboxes. This was Big Brother, the FCC, the people who dealt with radio waves on a scale far beyond my tiny shed. I ripped it open with trembling hands. The letter was dense, packed with legal and technical jargon that made my head spin. Words like spectrum integrity, unlicensed operation, Part 15 violations, and harmful interference jumped out at me like tiny, aggressive ninjas. But the message, despite the baffling terminology, was terrifyingly clear. A formal complaint had been filed. My little hobby station, KLLEO, was accused of exceeding its legal Part 15 power limits. And the kicker? The potential fines listed had many, many zeros. Enough zeros to buy several sheds, a professional radio station, and maybe even a small island. This was no longer funny. It was federal. And the feds, I knew, had no sense of humor when it came to their airwaves. I immediately called Dave, my voice high-pitched and panicked. Dave, they used the word forfeiture. That sounds like they're gonna take my kidneys. Or my grill. Oh God, not my grill? Dave's calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a frantic, "I told you so." I told you, Leo. I told you not to mess with the feds. They don't have a sense of humor. Their mascot is a bald eagle, not a laughing hyena. You're going to be fined into oblivion, you maniac. The sheer terror of potential financial ruin hit me like a ton of bricks. My little rebellion had gone too far. My smug satisfaction at annoying Brenda had led me down a path to federal audit. I imagined agents in dark suits storming my shed, dismantling my beloved equipment, probably confiscating my vinyl collection as evidence. For a full day, I was in a funk. KLEO went silent. The Facebook group, usually vibrant with neighborly gossip and complaints, was filled with worried posts. Is KLEO okay? Has the man finally silenced the voice of the people? Even Brenda, I imagined, was probably wondering where the background soundtrack to her day had gone. But then, my stubbornness, my sheer, unshakable belief in the principle of the thing, kicked in. I wasn't going down without a fight. Or, at the very least, without a glorious, defiant farewell. If KLEO was to be silenced, it would go out with the biggest, loudest, most epic broadcast Sunset Meadows had ever heard. I announced online, in the KLEO Facebook group, that there would be one final, grand broadcast. The last stand of KLEO. The whole neighborhood began buzzing. The day of the final broadcast arrived, cloaked in a sense of impending doom and rock and roll glory. Chloe was with me in the studio shed, looking worried but resolute, managing the soundboard. Dave was there for moral support, pacing so hard he was wearing a groove in the sound-dampening floor tiles. "Are you sure about this, Leo?" Dave asked, wringing his hands. "Going out with a bang usually attracts bigger bangs from the other side." "It's about making a statement, Dave," I said, my voice trying to project a confidence I didn't entirely feel. "A statement that says, you can regulate our airwaves, but you can't regulate our spirit." Chloe, ever the pragmatist, handed me a glass of water. "Just try not to say anything overtly defamatory this time. We don't need any more legal problems." I adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and hit the on switch. The KLIO jingle, a cheesy, royalty-free jingle I'd bought for $5, filled the air. "Good evening, Sunset Meadows," I announced, my voice trembling slightly, but quickly gaining strength. "This is Leo Martinez, your humble host, bringing you what might be the final glorious transmission from KLEO 88.1, the sound of freedom and, well, you know the rest. Tonight we play the hits. Tonight we remember what we fought for. And tonight we say goodbye." I launched into a furious medley of Don't Stop Believin', We Will Rock You, and of course, Tom Sawyer. I spoke directly to my listeners, sharing my journey from passive-aggressive note to federal target. I gave a grand, heartfelt, and ridiculously dramatic monologue about freedom, about the power of music, and yes, about the undeniable right to grill in peace and not have your mailbox dictated by bureaucratic beige. I thanked my listeners, the silent and not-so-silent majority who had found a voice, however tiny, on my little station. "They can take our broadcast," I declared, my voice rising in a crescendo of emotion. "But they can never take our freedom to complain about mailbox colors. They can never take our right to a properly aerated lawn, if we choose to aerate it. And they can certainly never take our classic rock." Just as I was reaching the peak of my impassioned plea, a flash of red and blue light filled the shed window. Then another, and another. Officer Miller and Officer Davis were back. And this time, they weren't alone. Standing between them, looking impossibly stern and utterly devoid of humor, was a man in a boring gray suit. Brenda, of course, was standing on her meticulously kept lawn, arms crossed, a look of unholy triumph plastered across her face. I kept broadcasting, describing the scene live. "And it appears the cavalry has arrived, folks. Not to save us, unfortunately. 2 of our finest officers, Miller and Davis, are here, and they're accompanied by a gentleman who is either here to audit my tax returns or recruit me for the Men in Black. And yes, folks, Brenda is on her lawn, looking like she just won the lottery of suburban spite." The suited man, who I now realized was Agent Thompson from the FCC, walked purposefully towards the shed door. He knocked once, sharply. I slowly faded out the music, the last notes of Free Bird echoing into silence. I took a deep, shaky breath and opened the door. Agent Thompson, his face unreadable, looked from me to the microphone. "Mr. Martinez, I'm Agent Thompson with the FCC. We need to talk about your transmitter's effective radiated power." Brenda, unable to contain herself, called out from her lawn, her voice cracking with glee. "Ha! Got you, Leo!" But then, something incredible happened. From down the street, a window opened. Someone yelled, "Leave KLEO alone!" Another window opened. "Yeah! Down with beige mailboxes!" Soon, a small, socially distanced crowd of neighbors began to gather. They carried hastily scrawled signs, "Free 88.1, no more HOA tyranny, my grass, my rules." They had heard my final broadcast. They had mobilized. Officer Davis turned to Officer Miller, his eyes wide. He muttered, "Well, this is a first. I usually get cat-up-a-tree calls, not a community uprising over classic rock." I looked at Agent Thompson, then at the growing crowd, then back at Brenda's utterly bewildered expression. This was it. The glorious, messy, ridiculous climax to my suburban radio war. The negotiation took place not in a sterile federal building, but at my very own kitchen table. Agent Thompson, the FCC man in the gray suit, was surprisingly calm. He sat across from me, a legal pad balanced on his knee, while Officers Miller and Davis stood by the door, looking like bewildered chaperones at a particularly awkward school play. Chloe, my steadfast engineer, sat beside me, offering a comforting hand squeeze under the table. "Mr. Martinez," Agent Thompson began, his voice devoid of emotion, "let's be clear. Your intentions, while perhaps misguided, were not, to our knowledge, malicious. However, your equipment, specifically with the additions to the antenna and signal amplification, was broadcasting well beyond the legally permitted Part 15 limits for an unlicensed device." I gulped. So I wasn't just annoying Brenda? Thompson actually allowed himself a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk. "No, Mr. Martinez. According to our field tests, your signal was interfering with automated garage door openers at the Whispering Pines retirement community, roughly 3 towns over. Every time you played Stairway to Heaven, a dozen Hondas would just open." My jaw dropped. "So I'm a public nuisance on a much grander scale than I ever imagined." "Impressively so, for a kit purchased from Amazon," Thompson conceded. "And your segment on the tyranny of beige mailboxes briefly caused an emergency broadcast override in a local dentist's waiting room radio." Officer Davis let out a snort that he quickly covered with a cough. Miller just shook her head. "We also detected some minor interference with a local amateur radio enthusiast's weekly chess club broadcast," Thompson added, looking at me pointedly. "Apparently, they kept hearing snippets of Bohemian Rhapsody over their strategy discussions. It was all too absurd. I couldn't help but let out a nervous chuckle. Thompson, however, remained professional. Given that this was clearly a hobbyist situation gone wildly, accidentally, and impressively wrong, and not an attempt at commercial broadcasting, we're offering a deal. You dismantle the station completely. You sign a consent decree promising not to engage in unlicensed broadcasting again, and you pay a modest fine." He slid a paper across the table. It wasn't the millions I'd dreaded, but it was still a hefty sum that would make a significant dent in my savings. I looked at Chloe, then at Dave, who had somehow materialized in the doorway, drawn by the scent of federal negotiation. They both gave me a subtle nod. The game was up. I had fought the law, and the law, surprisingly, had been somewhat understanding. "Deal," I said immediately, signing the paper with a flourish that belied my internal terror. The next day dawned with a strange quiet. K-Leo was no more. I was out in my yard, coiling cables, dismantling the now silent antenna mast with a heavy heart. Brenda was in her yard, meticulously deadheading her petunias, pretending not to notice me. The silence between us was palpable, almost a living thing. Then she broke it. "The garage doors," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. "Was that you?" I paused, a length of coax cable in my hand. "Apparently. Sorry about that, Brenda. Especially the Hondas." She actually let out a small sigh. "My sister lives in that community. She thought her car was haunted. Said she kept getting strange urges to sing Queen." A moment of silence stretched between us. A strange, almost comfortable silence. Then, she added, almost begrudgingly, "It was a little loud, Leo, your station." "I know," I admitted, genuinely contrite. "I went a bit overboard. I really am sorry." Another pause. Then, the almost unbelievable. "Sir, but my nephew," Brenda continued, turning to face me fully, a faint, almost hidden smirk playing on her lips. "My nephew thought the HOA Horror Stories segment was hilarious. He even called in once about his unapproved flamingo lawn ornament." My eyes widened. I stared at her. Brenda Albright. Admitting she had a nephew who listened to Kay Leo. Admitting it was hilarious. This wasn't friendship, not by a long shot, but it was a truce. A nod of grudging respect given and received across the fence line. It was more than I ever expected. Just then, Sal and Vince arrived, their trusty toolbox in hand. "Heard you went down in a blaze of glory, kid," Sal rumbled, looking at the dismantled equipment. "The feds, huh? You're a legend down at the supply depot. Everyone's talking about the guy who accidentally jammed every garage door in a 5-mile radius with Stairway to Heaven." "Yeah, well, legends have to pay fines," I said, handing them their final check for the shed construction and the now illegal antenna mast. Vince squinted at me, his perpetual smirk widening. "Let us know if you ever need a panic room built, kid, or maybe a Faraday cage. You seem like the type to accidentally discover alien signals next." I grinned. "I'll keep it in mind." Weeks turned into a quiet month. The studio shed, now stripped of its broadcasting equipment, stood quietly in my backyard. It was just a shed again, albeit a very well-insulated, heavily wired, and slightly over-engineered shed. The absence of Kay Leo's daily broadcasts left a strange, almost palpable void. My afternoons, once filled with angry rants about obscure HOA bylaws, were now occupied by actual graphic design work. It was productive, but decidedly less exciting. One beautiful Saturday afternoon, I was back at my grill flipping burgers. The smell of charcoal and sizzling meat was still glorious. This time, however, the music playing in the background was coming from a small, high-quality Bluetooth speaker at a very reasonable volume. Hotel California by the Eagles was a soothing, perfectly legal soundtrack to my culinary endeavors. Chloe was with me, lounging in a lawn chair, sipping an iced tea. She glanced at the speaker, then at me, a playful smile on her lips. "You know," she said, her voice teasing, "for all that trouble, the federal fines, the legal threats, the community uprising, you could have just bought one of these at the beginning." She gestured to the Bluetooth speaker. I chuckled, turning my burger. "And miss out on becoming a suburban folk hero, facing down the federal government, accidentally jamming garage door openers, and impressing a beautiful sound engineer with my sheer audacity." I raised an eyebrow at her. She laughed, a warm, bright sound. "When you put it that way, I suppose it was worth it, mostly." We fell into a comfortable silence, enjoying the sun and the perfectly legal, perfectly ambient music. The air in Sunset Meadows felt calmer, less charged, less filled with the ghost of classic rock rebellion. Dave showed up a few minutes later, beers in hand, looking relaxed for once. He plopped down in a chair beside Chloe, took a long swig of his beer, and sighed contentedly. "You know," he said, shaking his head slightly, "they're still talking about you on the community Facebook page, seriously. They're trying to get the HOA to change the rule on mailbox colors. They're calling it the Kay Leo Accords." My eyes widened. "See? I'm a political activist, a grassroots pioneer. My legacy lives on even without the airwaves." Dave just grunted, taking another sip. "Your legacy is going to be me having to bail you out of jail when you try to launch a satellite radio station next." I just grinned. The grill sizzled. The eagles sang softly. Across the street, Brenda's lawn remained immaculate, her begonias, presumably, no longer vibrating. And for the first time in a long time, the silence felt less like defeat and more like peace. A hard-won, slightly expensive, but entirely justified peace. I looked at my quiet backyard, at my friends, at the peaceful fence line I shared with Brenda. I took a bite of my perfectly cooked burger. It was good, really good. Yeah, it was totally worth it.